das menschliche Gebeine zurückgeführt werden.
This is that clip you wanted me to play.
1 second, just let me get to it if it's okay.
We are here
Last November we went to a symposium called We Want Them Back,
to talk
and there was an activist from Tanzania called Mnyaka Sururu Mboro who gave this speech.
about our ancestors who were brutally murdered and still they are not in the graves. So before we do anything, we have to ask them permission to talk about them.
And he asked the permission of his ancestors. He's standing at the podium and then he takes out a bottle of, surprisingly, of Rotkäppchen, East German Sekt.
Champagne Sekt, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then he walks around and distributes a little bit of it into this potted plant or tree behind him. Watching it, it was unclear what was going on, but, everyone was completely rapt.
Well, there you are, look, in the video.
Yeah. And then after that was over, he gave this really impressive speech. I remember being struck with it at the time.
Free us from the museums, from the basement, from the clinics, where they are keeping us in the shelves with skulls of monkeys, gorillas, and other animals. Bring us back home and rest us in peace forever.
Welcome to Dig Where You Stand. I'm Benjamin Stoller, founder of Kolo Media.
I'm Peter Matthews, a writer at the Berliner magazine.
What we played at the beginning of this episode was recording from a symposium we went to called We Want Them Back. It was about human remains, and we should start right there. What are human remains, or I should say ancestral remains? What is that?
What we mean by that is human bodies or human body parts, specifically about people whose bodies were stolen under German colonial rule and taken and still remain in Berlin museums. I mean, in the We Want Them Back report, you read about a user going into the Berlin State Library, opening a manuscript and finding a tuft of human hair. Or there's the head of the Lautarchiv, the German sound archive, who he went through a cardboard box, opened it, and then there's a human larynx in there with some, next to a light bulb.
It's like these things keep turning up.
Right, they do keep turning up, and that's why we wanted to look into it further.
As you heard from the beginning when Mboro asked permission, at the end of this episode, very, very end, we also asked permission from the ancestors. It's important, though, at this beginning to have it clear, this is kind of an absurd question, Why are there so many dead bodies, so many ancestral remains in Berlin museums?
There's, in a way, no simple answer. What we kept finding is that this isn't historical in the sense that it's over. It's not just something that's happened. There's descendants that really are looking for demanding their grandfathers or their ancestors' body parts back so that they can have closure on this. So it's a kind of history that isn't yet buried.
So the plan is to do this in 3 episodes. We'll release them monthly. This is episode 1. We have a lot of interviews and other material we can't fit into these 3 episodes, so we're going to put them out at digwhereyoustand.show or at digwhereyoustandshow on Instagram, and you should follow us there so you know when the next stuff is released.
Anyway, but in this episode, we just want to ask just the simple question, how did these ancestral remains come to Berlin in the first place?
The person we're going to start with is somebody called Mangi Meli. He was murdered by German forces in 1900 in Tanzania, which back then was called German East Africa. And let's start there.
So there are 2 people we need to introduce first.
My name is Mnyaka Sururu Mboro.
My name is Konradin Kunze.
Mboro we heard in the introduction, and Konradin Kunze, who's an actor originally, but he's become an activist on the subject. Anyway, both Mboro and Konradin Kunze were engaged in the same task, which was to locate a missing head, the head of Mangi Meli.
Mangi is that word we use for a chief. Mangi Meli was so strong, fought bitterly against the Germans.
And Mangi Meli was executed on 2nd March 1900 by the German colonial administration.
In 1900, today's Tanzania was known as German East Africa. It was a colony of the German Empire, founded about 15 years earlier by a man called Karl Peters.
Karl Peters is a notorious German colonialist. And Karl Peters his name was also Mkono wa Damu, which means like bloody hand, because he killed people deliberately and arbitrarily. So
Karl Peters was a colonialist.
There's a famous photograph of him
where you can see him sitting down. He's in a uniform. in a white uniform, and there's an African man behind him also wearing a black uniform. It's kind of a creepy picture. He's holding a sort of riding crop.
And his mustaches are waxed and pointed horizontally. He's clearly like a well-presented officer who looks very strict.
Yes, and beneath him it says Dr. Karl Peters, 1884, founder of German East Africa. And it's got that sort of creepy old-time German font.
There was the story that he killed one of his concubines.
The story of Mangi Meli begins when Karl Peters discovers one of his concubines, a young girl, with another boy. The boy is seized and hanged, but the girl gets away at first.
The boy was hanged on the spot, but the girl could run, and she was hidden. And they said, no, we are not going to give her back to be hanged.
Mangi Meli is involved because it's an ally of his who protects the girl that Karl Peters is after. And the Germans respond violently with a military campaign they used in the colonies called a punitive expedition.
This was when Mangi Meli just came into power, and they said, no, I will not let the Germans come to my territory.
But he started burning the fields, the huts, where children were in. They had to give this poor girl, and she was hanged.
And so the Germans at some point decided, okay, we need to get rid of him. And they tried to attack him, and they lost. He killed both of the leading officers who tried to attack him, and the rest fled. And for a couple of months, the whole Kilimanjaro region was free again.
Well, the thing I'd like to say is that, Churchill wrote about wars in East Africa, and he talks about the sort of splendid game of going there and mowing down thousands of people with these machine guns. There's a quote where he says, "To the great mass of those who took part in the little wars, in those vanished light-hearted days, this was only a sporting element in a splendid game."
Churchill says that?
Churchill says that.
And
they talk about having a delightful lunch before the battle and stuff like that.
But I think the point is that Mangi Meli kills some of the colonizer forces who came in probably expecting not to be challenged like that.
Well, I think that, once they bring the machine guns...
But that's after.
Yeah.
Until they gathered a huge force, even early machine guns and cannons, and attacked Meli. And at this time he had to surrender.
Mangi Meli is not executed right away. For a few years, he and the people he represents are allowed to live under German colonial control there. They're taxed, though. They're taxed exorbitantly. They're forced to pay the Germans huge amounts of equipment material for their military installations, and they're forced to deliver valuables like elephant tusks.
And then, for some reason, the Mangis are rounded up.
Right. There's some sort of unexplained event. There's an attack on a military base. It's not clear exactly what happened, right? The Mangis in the region are blamed for the attack. It's possible that it was like a friendly fire situation, I guess, or like a gun went off at night. Who knows? I don't think we know.
Do you think that? I don't
but basically, there is an attack on a German military installation there.
I mean, there were regular attacks across this whole period. There were regular uprisings by people forced to work in cotton plantations or different resistors across the country.
This specific one in 1900, right? It's early 1900. Whoever carried out this final attack, this is the moment when the colonial officers decided this is enough, and they want to get rid of these local troublemakers, these local leaders, these heroes, people like Mangi Meli.
And so this is what led to Mangi Meli's execution.
And it was really a traumatic event for the whole region, because the Mangis were summoned to be executed on the tree, and not only the Mangis but all the communities from Old Moshi, but even from other villages nearby. They had to come and watch.
And Mboro's grandmother was present at the execution. We heard him speak at the beginning, and that's kind of one of the ways that the history has been passed down, is through this oral tradition of each generation telling the next what they saw.
She told me. So I was there, and I had to watch the whole hanging, because the Germans forced us to go to that village, and I was there. She said he was so strong, fought for his life, and it took him more than 6 hours before he died. And then at the end, after he died, the head was chopped off and were sent to German.
And his head, that was the oral history, his head was taken to Germany.
And this head must be brought back.
It's worth taking a second to think about the impact this had on the community. By all accounts, they were devastated. They were devastated by having to watch 18 of their local leaders or kings be executed in public. And then, after that, for their heads to be chopped off and removed.
Yeah, it's a show of strength. It's a show of power. It's a show of control. You can understand how witnessing something like this leaves the kind of mark that passes through the generations.
Yeah, and then there's, I think, spiritual and cultural sort of symbolic beliefs about how to treat the remains of the dead, which were known to the German forces at the time. And I think that it's the effect on the descendants of Mangi Meli that got Konradin Kunze involved in the subject.
I met Meli, who is the grandson of Mangi Meli. He showed me the tree where Mangi Meli and 18 others were hanged. He showed me the graves of the German soldiers who are still there. They have graves. And it was actually very moving because we'll never forget that he's an old man. I think now he's 94. And he knelt down at the German graves to wipe away the dust and the stones to show us basically our ancestors. But then he again said, but I don't have a proper grave because I miss the head of my grandfather. So it was then, at the same time, I promised to try whatever I can to locate the head of Mangi Meli.
Because this is the thing, nobody knows where Mangi Meli's head actually is.
It's still in Berlin.
We don't know where it is. It must be brought back. It must be brought back.
Okay, Peter, here we are in Berlin. Now, about 100 years later from the Mangi Meli story, Berlin is now the capital of the Federal Republic of Germany, not the German Empire.
Right, so you might think today, how would you go about finding a skull from 120 years ago? You'd think it would be pretty difficult, but it turns out there's one obvious place to look. There's actually a collection of skulls known as the S-Sammlung.
The S stands for skull, like Schädel, which is the German word for skull. So it's literally called the Skull Collection.
Exactly, and it contains these ancestral remains from lots of different places, but there is a section, from Africa, from Tanzania, from precisely this period.
My name is Bernhard Heeb. I'm an archaeologist and curator at the Museum for Pre- and Early History at the State Museum of Berlin.
Right, so we asked Bernhard Heeb whether he believed that the skull was contained within the collections of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, which is a sort of umbrella group managing a lot of the state museums in Berlin.
Do you believe that his skull is contained within the collections of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation?
Mangi Meli is a very complicated question because we don't have any hints that he was or is in the collection. The moment I don't think this remains, I think, not likely in the collection. Maybe never were. And of course it would be a very, very nice thing to identify his remains and bring them back. But sadly, obviously not in our collection.
It's easy to get lost here. Maybe we need to do a quick rundown of what happened to Mangi Meli's head after his execution.
We don't know what happened to the head, but we can say maybe what happened to other bones that were taken from Tanzania.
Yeah, where would they have gone? How would that have worked?
Well, if you go step by step, the skull would probably have been treated. I found this guide published in 1876 in Australia, actually, about collecting museum specimens. It advises collectors to skin the head as far as the tip of the nose, remove all flesh from it, take out the eyes, and remove the brains.
This is grisly.
It's horrible. In fact, the process of scraping away is called maceration, and archaeologists can detect those little nicks on the skull. And that could have been done by a German soldier, or maybe there were even prisoners forced to do that work.
So then what would have happened to the skull itself?
Well, there's records of other bones from Tanzania being taken, actually dinosaur bones, and they were packed in trunks filled with cotton. There were cotton plantations in the area. You can imagine the cotton in the box being put into a trunk and transported. At the time in 1900, they were building a railway, the Usambara Railway, which connected this area near Kilimanjaro to the coast. So then maybe it goes from Old Moshi to the coast, a steamship takes it with all this other raw materials and other objects.
But I picture it like one trunk, or like it's packed in on the ship among, 10,000 other packages and trunks, or I don't know how else they would have carried it.
I mean, the exports, I think, from Tanzania, there was like the sisal plant, which was used for making rope, cotton, rubber, gold, coffee, and then, of course, the bodies of other human beings. And then it comes back to Berlin, where Berlin's like a central collection hub for stuff coming from across the empire. So you're getting stuff sent from the Pacific, from South America, from Africa, and it's all arriving in the ethnological collection where they do this markings on the skulls. They literally wrote in ink on the skulls S and then a identity number.
Yeah, and who's doing that?
Well, the person managing the skull collection was an Austrian scientist called Felix von Lüschan. We're going to get back to him.
I picture the two places where the skull left, Tanzania, German East Africa. I can't imagine what it looked like in 1900. I imagine it had less modern infrastructure. And then on the other hand, it arrives, like you said, steamship, Hamburg, major harbor, another train, and then Berlin with the imperial capital, the Prussian imperial capital, with many of the streets and buildings and museums that are still there today. The same size, the same stone, the same massive, impressive, classical architecture.
Yes, and there's still streets in Berlin named after some of the key figures. I mean, Mboro talks about walking through the African Viertel, the African Quarter in Berlin, and seeing Petersallee, that is street named after Karl Peters.
The bloody hand.
It is about the traces of colonial traces, like in African quarters. When I came there and I found a street, Peters Avenue, I was almost collapsed. How can someone glorify such a terrible, horrible, cruel man who hanged a lot of people on the slopes of Mountain Kilimanjaro, and he was honored here.
So when Mboro starts to look for this head of Mangi Meli, he's not looking into the collections as they were 120 years ago. He's looking at them today after World War and a divided Berlin, and so it's a difficult task to find. You have to deal with the collections as they are today.
So we'll start this kind of second section of this episode off with a kind of inventory so we can get an overview and understand where are all these ancestral remains from colonial contexts held right now in Berlin.
Yeah, let's just try and track exactly where in Berlin right now holds human remains.
Do you have a clear idea how much is from colonial? I mean, you say this, but do we know in detail?
You mean by numbers now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say we have around 3,000 to 3,500 skulls from colonial context.
That's Heeb again from the Museum of Pre and Early History. That's 3,500 remains from colonial contexts. The next big candidate is the Ethnological Museum at the Humboldt Forum. They've got between, I think, 3,000 and 4,000, depends a bit on how you count. Those are the two biggest ones. After that, the next largest collection, another 3,500 human remains, is held by the Berlin Society for Anthropology, Ethnology and Prehistory. They don't provide exact information, which is quite controversial.
But so quick math. We have 3,000 to 4,000 at the Ethnological Collection at the Humboldt Forum. We have 3,000 to 3,500 at the Museum of Early and Prehistory. And then we have this 3,500 in this sort of private collection that no one's allowed to know too many details of, which is strange. But is that it so far?
That's not it. In 2014, there was construction work at the Freie Universität in Dahlem, and construction workers there, they disturbed some large pits which were filled with bones.
Weren't they found in sacks?
Yeah, 7 sacks were removed immediately. They found they were full of human bones and animal bones, and actually they were burned. And that caused a big scandal, and we'll come to that later. But after they were discovered, archaeologists said, wait, and did some more digging on campus, and they turned up another 16,000 bone fragments.
In the same spot?
In the same place. It got a special attention because these remains were probably lying next to human body parts sent back from Auschwitz during the Nazi period. We're going to get into all of that, but for our purposes, we can just say that this is another significant potential site of human remains in Berlin.
Okay, so now we've covered it all.
No, but we're getting there. A lot of the collections we've talked about already were held at one point by the Charité Hospital.
This is like, for people not in Berlin, Charité is like the Mayo Clinic of Europe, right? It's like it's a big famous research hospital, and they've got lots of different departments and And a bunch of human remains, apparently.
A really good museum and a lot of different human remains. Well, they had many. At the moment, there are 58 human remains from colonial contexts still held by the Charité's collection. After that, there's the Museum for Natuurkunde, the Natural History Museum. We know they have some. They wouldn't comment on the subject to us, but we know that since 2021, they've been working on a provenance report.
You haven't talked about the ones sort of scattered around. What are those?
Yeah, then, I mean, those are the big collections. After that, exactly, there's stuff that still keeps turning up. There are 4 skeletons of unknown origin being held at the Weissensee Art School. The Lautarchiv has those human larynxes which turned up in a box. The German History Museum has some braids of hair stolen from the Boxer Rebellion in China, and they've got a shrunken head, which they don't know where it came from. And the Stabi, the State Library, has another tuft of hair, which was actually found by Konradin Kunze when he was going through a manuscript.
So if my math is right, altogether that's more than 15,000 human remains from colonial contexts kept in Berlin-ish.
Yes, it's hard to say exact numbers. Some have been destroyed, some are sort of unknown, but yeah, over 10,000.
Over 10,000. And Mangi Meli's head could be one of those in the, 10,000. And
well, yes, at first, if you're looking for a single skull, there'd sort of be 10,000 potential candidates.
And when you were just describing that, I also want to make a point here. All these different places, you said one is a sound archive. Is that right? Like it has old recordings. One is an archaeological museum. One is that place where I take my kid to see dinosaurs, right?
Yeah.
So it's surprising to me that they're held, all these human remains are held in such a range of different kinds of archives, I guess.
When you look into it, it seems like everywhere's got some human remains. And I think that's why it's important to think about this kind of period of collection that, when the museums were filling themselves up, when they were building their collections, that human remains were just one item among others which they thought was valuable and wanted to have.
And what we've talked about are really just the places that we know of, the places that Isabelle Reiman wrote about in this report from the We Want Them Back symposium. So these are the ones like publicly...
Yes, exactly. But there are lots of different museums which didn't want to take part in the report, that didn't offer to have their collections looked through. And also, I think that museums often don't really know what they have. And so the more that they look into the archives, the more they find. So Konradin Kunze, I think, described that dynamic.
So institutions often say, no, we don't have anything. And then they say, oh yeah, maybe we have a few, but we don't know exactly where they're from. And then they discover, oh, we actually have quite a few, and then the numbers keep on increasing.
This is something we also heard about when we spoke to Ilja Labischinski, provenance researcher at the Berlin State Museums.
My name is Ilja Labischinski. That's, I think, a problem of most museums. There are always things turning up where you didn't expect things to be. It is also true for human remains that there are human remains that just show up where we didn't expect them.
All right, should we now take a minute to talk about the Humboldt Forum?
How long have we got?
Haha. Okay, I guess introduce it to us.
So the Humboldt Forum is a controversial museum in Berlin, maybe Berlin's newly opened museum. Lots of people hate it. And it's a good example of how Germany has had, let's say, a blind or blinkered attitude towards its colonial past.
You mean because the museum exists at all, or how do you mean?
Well, it was this hugely expensive project funded by a lot of conservative elements and right-wingers, and so they rebuilt the Prussian Kaiser's Palace at massive expense in this kind of, neo-classical style. And then after they've decided to build it, they have to think what they're going to fill it with, and they choose the contents of the Ethnological Museum, which means basically filling it with imperial loot and the bodies of victims of the German power.
I mean, it's definitely, if you gave me like a bunch of millions of euros and told me to open a museum, it's not what I would put in a museum.
Yeah, it's a controversial kind of barbaric museum to build a massive palace and then fill it with things you've stolen and people you've killed. It's like a kind of museum that Genghis Khan would build.
Right. Okay. All right. So let's keep going. The Humboldt Forum is extremely controversial, maybe never should have been built in the first place. You already said imperial loot. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like imperial loot stuff from the colonies, or?
Well, they chose to fill it with the contents of the Ethnological Museum, which was previously housed in Dahlem, the Museum for Völkerkunde. So there's the Museum for Naturkunde and the Museum for Völkerkunde, and there's the Museum for Natural History and the Museum for the history of peoples.
Right, folk. I guess that we can figure that out, yeah.
The history of different peoples around the world. So they sent out explorers and scientists to go to every region of the world and gather material, cultural objects, skulls, bracelets, whatever. They wanted to make this incredible archive of all of humankind.
So here's again Ilja Labischinski.
Well, it was founded at the end of the 19th century, so just before German colonialism officially started. I think the founding date is 1876. So the founding idea of the founding director Adolf Bastian was to create an archive of humankind.
At that time, people thought that the sort of rise of civilization and modernity was going to destroy different cultures around the world.
The idea of that time was that the people all around the world, the culture are dying out. And he wanted to preserve that culture in the museum. So he wanted to collect as much as possible to save it for mankind, which was a very Eurocentric idea.
Speaking about the American Indians, Adolf Bastian, who founded the Ethnological Museum, said they were vanishing like snow before the rising sun of civilization. And so the people doing this collecting were kind of in a hurry, and they sent out anthropologists and scientists and commissioned merchants to collect all of this human material by any means necessary. Ilja Labischinski gave us the example of Franz Boas, who's like a well-known, famous anthropologist, but he also, despite being like a serious scientist, he did all of this really unethical collection.
He was absolutely clear that he was doing something illegal and unethical. He was digging up graveyards, getting people drunk, paying people not to look at him, and being aware that he's stealing skulls from a graveyard. And he even hired people that they steal for him. And when he sent the boxes, in this case to a US museum, he declared them as something else. And the people who stole them for him, who he paid these people to steal it from the graveyard, they went to prison.
So he hired people to steal for him, and then when they were caught, he got them sent to prison in his place.
So he was absolutely clear that he was doing something illegal, unethical, and that's not just true for Franz Boas, but for a lot of people. They knew they are doing something wrong.
Franz Boas has a quote often attributed to him, quote, "It is most unpleasant work to steal bones from a grave, but what is the use? Someone has to do it."
Yeah, I think there's also a quote somewhere of someone writing, I can't remember who, but they write to Lushan and they say, like, getting any artifact involves a little bit of violence. Then there's another collector, Jan Czekanovsky. He collected a lot of material for the S collection. He was seemingly a well-meaning scientist who did a lot of research, but he also used every means at his disposal to collect skulls. We spoke about him with Bernhard Heeb.
Czekanovsky was an anthropologist from Poland, and he was sent with the Mecklenburg expedition to Eastern Africa. And he should collect not only skulls, but mainly skulls, because he was an anthropologist. And to be honest, Czekanovsky was not happy about that job. He criticized that in many private letters, and he said, the only way I can get my hands on human remains is to hurt feelings, to avoid standards we normally would have. And he was not really happy about that. He criticized us quite often. But it didn't keep him from collecting 900 skulls, going into grave caves. He was robbing graves. He was buying skulls. He used all possibilities to collect.
Sometimes it was the agents with the most humanistic motives, that were able to carry out the most ruthless exploitation. You know, they went and learned the local languages, befriended native people, charted the flora and fauna of the region, but then collected human skulls by the hundreds or thousands. And they didn't see any contradiction. They had this kind of romantic idea of the inevitable destruction of these societies, and that kind of propelled them into these regions around the world. You know, often they saw civilization as a kind of coming storm, but often they were the storm that they feared.
The storm probably looks something like the Mecklenburg expedition that Heeb mentions. We could probably make an entire episode or series about that. What's the salient detail in that one?
Well, I suppose Czekanovsky was in it. I mean, he was appointed by the Royal Ethnological Museum to join the expedition, and he went gathering human remains explicitly.
Duke Adolf Friedrich of Mecklenburg wrote a book, actually, called In the Heart of Africa. He says, Dr. Czekanowski fell in with us again. He had already been very active and obtained possession of a considerable number of skulls and other anthropological specimens, amongst which were 5 complete skeletons. I mean, this guy, Czekanowski, I picture him running around with trunks behind him in like a caravan. I mean, he's got trunks full of skeletons. If Heeb said he had collected 900 skulls in his career, I think of all the stuff they're collecting, like the masses, and these incredibly valuable, meaningful things.
Yeah, it's kind of scary how like vast a scientific operation it was, and how, in a way, unserious the people leading it were. I think at the beginning of the book, he says something like he was either going to do this expedition or go tiger hunting in India. And
right.
You know,
unlike Carl Peters, he doesn't look as serious. If you look at his picture on Wikipedia,
yeah, no, he's more of an aristocrat.
Yeah, he's got his legs folded. He's got his white gloves on his lap, and he's wearing one of those Prussian helmets with the spike on top, which is called a Pickelhaube.
Exactly, but
they're always a bit ridiculous. That's all I mean. That Pickelhaube always makes me. It looks like Marvin the Martian.
In the account he writes, they travel a lot. They hunt lions. They find different stuff. It's written like an adventure book, I suppose. They're given a large colonial troop,
like massive.
Yeah, it's a massive expedition. They've got like 700 people traveling across. So they've got mercenaries, like troops going with them, traveling with them. And there's a quote from the book where they talk about how much they eat. And I think they said during the first 14 days, they disposed of no fewer than 20,000 bunches of bananas, 50 bananas to the bunch. Then there's more. There's like sacks of peas, 300 sacks of peas, over 30 bullocks, various game. So they're just going, like, collecting loads, consuming loads. They are kind of like it's like a swarm.
30 bullocks in 14 days.
30 bullocks, yeah.
But
20,000 bunches of bananas.
Right, times 50 total individual bananas. I guess they were smaller back then or something, but even so. Anyway, the reason why we're going through all of this is because these are exactly the expeditions that got these remains and stolen artifacts and things back to Europe. So they're traveling through collecting chunks of this stuff. And like you say, this whole period's very interesting, and it is sort of the foundation of many of the museums in Europe.
I mean, the extraction of these human remains goes hand in hand with the extraction of material resources from the colonies back to Europe. And so you've got whalers gathering oil for lamps or for soap, and they also collect skulls in the Pacific. Or there are people prospecting for mines who gathered skulls. As we said, Mangi Meli's head was probably packed in cotton from one of the cotton plantations.
Basically, what you're saying is that skulls and human bodies were just another item to be traded on the market.
Yeah, there was a market for them, for skulls as curios, but that might go into private hands. But I mean, usually the museums acted as like the monopoly buyers for human remains. Konradin Kunze describes it as a trafficking network.
I was speaking about the ancestral remains trafficking network. It was really something like that. And this goes beyond Germany.
There was this imperial flow of goods, this extraction back toward Europe. We've already talked about this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this is partly why Berlin has such a big collection.
Yes, I think all of the major centers of power wanted to have a big collection of human remains. In some way, it's sort of what defines, or there's something about that. If you didn't have one, then you weren't a big European city.
There are a lot of collections everywhere. In Berlin, Leipzig has a big collection. Zurich has a big collection. Vienna has a very big collection. Paris has a big collection. London has a big collection. I think also Hermitage in Petersburg has a very big collection. And most of them don't want to talk about that.
Heeb told us it's almost as if it makes it less interesting that everyone all over Europe have a big collection.
Yeah, I mean, it was almost like, it's not a big deal, everyone's doing it. But in a way, you can think, well, it is a big deal if everyone's doing it. It's an insane thing for everyone to be doing. But, I mean, specifically in Berlin, they were, like, really good at it. And by 1900, the museums were, like, totally overflowing. They couldn't fit the stuff in. It was, like, packed in stairways, in basements. The different museum directors complained they had too much. And it's not just skulls. They're taking, huge things. If you go to the Humboldt Forum today, you see a lot of them, and they're massive. I mean, whole boats, houses, thrones, door frames, elephant tusks. And human remains are coming too in the most insane variety. There's gloves made out of human skin, drumsticks made from bones.
There are hundreds of mummified persons and also body parts. But there's also, for example, one a heart, which is was kind of smoked and preserved in that way.
It wasn't just scientists and anthropologists who were transporting these human remains. It was something that was joined in by lots of different people across society. Sailors had standing orders to collect human remains wherever they found them. And there were some human remains which were in the Charité collection, which were actually transported by the CEO of Deutsche Bank. He brought them back from Namibia to Berlin. So you've got to imagine this whole kind of machinery of plunder. And that's kind of the context into which Mangi Meli's head gets sent. And so when people like Mboro and Konradin Kunze are looking for that skull, they only have the clues that people left them at the time.
There's a likely place that you mentioned earlier. There is a specific collection with skulls that's being built by a man called Felix von Luschan.
Could you tell us a little bit about Felix von Luschan? Who was he and why did he collect these human remains?
He was an anthropologist and he worked for the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, end of the 19th century. And he was the main collector of human remains in this time in Berlin. And he collected, after all, around 10,000 skulls and skeletons. Not that much skeletons, mostly skulls from all over the world. That means also from Germany or from Austria, for example.
So Luschan was kind of obsessed with collecting skulls, and he built up these different collections. As we've mentioned, there was the S collection, the Schädelsammlung, the skull collection, and that had a huge amount of skulls from all over the world. And then he had the L collection, that stands for something like Lernmittelsammlung. That was actually sold by his widow after his death and bought by New York.
The idea behind his collection was that the more human remains he has in his collection, the more data he can work on. Especially the main idea was about defining races and to get an idea how they are connected. We don't know what the system was behind that, and it seems to be quite a chaos.
So, Peter, this is Heeb referring to what you mentioned earlier, the sort of brutal way in which the skulls were itemized or the way they were taken into the archive. Luschan and other ethnologists and people like him were writing directly on the skull with ink.
Yeah, so when the skull would come into the collection, they would write on the front of it, on the kind of frontal bone, the forehead, like S1359 or whatever.
Yeah, and Heeb tells us that might seem organized, but it was actually complete chaos.
We know that they also made mistakes. So that means sometimes things or information are written on a skull, which is obviously the wrong skull. Or, for example, we have a cranium and mandibulae, that's kiefer.
Jaw.
Yes, which have the same number, but obviously they don't fit together. We have that quite often. That means things must have been quite a mess. And to be honest, he was collecting, as you know, a lot of skulls, but he didn't really work on them. So this analysis, or this idea he had to collect a lot of skulls, to gather a lot of data, he never really worked with his collection, and that's ridiculous, you know. I don't know if he was a crazy collector or I don't know. But it's really strange that he never used the skulls for what he wanted them. So they were collected for more or less nothing.
Do you wish that he'd never collected them?
Of course. What for?
Then how did they start looking for Mangi Meli? When, as Heeb says, we know that the inventories that are left to us from back then, they're not even accurate.
Right, well, I mean, just take the S collection alone. Of the, let's say, 10,000 skulls in the S collection, maybe 3,500 are from colonial contexts, and then maybe 1,000 are from Africa. Whittle that down further, and there's a few hundred from Tanzania, and then you can inspect all of those separately. And I think when they did DNA testing to try and find Mangi Meli.
So is he there?
In order to work it out, they determined that they had 6 skulls that were good candidates to be him. And they took a small piece of the material and crushed it or whatever. It's slightly destructive, so you have to take a small fragment of the bone. You crush it, and then you can do the DNA testing.
And is one of them Mangi Meli?
No. A press release in 2019 confidently said that the remains of Chief Mangi Meli were not in the collections of the Preußische Kulturbesitz, Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation.
But that's not the end of the story, is it?
Well, I mean, I suppose that they only tested those 6 skulls, and as we've said, things keep turning up. One of the things about looking into anything is you find more than you expect. So they have actually found other people, different Mangis who were killed on the same execution site on that day, they found their skulls.
Yeah, I remember reading this. They found an advisor to the Mangis who, I mean, it's incredible that they found that they could match people.
Yeah, I think they found Mangi Lumbulu, who was another person killed that day, and his skull went from Lushan's private collection to the collection in New York. It was sold off by his widow after his death.
I want to talk about Mboro again, that activist that we talked about at the top of the show, and even the organization Decolonize Berlin. I mean, Mboro came here first in the 70s. It's like 50 years of working on this. He came on a promise to his grandma. We heard about Mboro's grandmother who witnessed Mangi Meli's death. And Mboro, Decolonize Berlin, these people and groups do have success in some of the campaigns in trying to get these streets like Peter's Allee that we heard Mboro talk about at the very beginning renamed. And I think that's a fight that's like ongoing.
But the whole area was named after these colonial war heroes, and now they're being renamed.
Anyway, what's the current thinking then with everything we know today on where Mangi Meli could be?
Every opportunity probably still hasn't been exhausted to find him in some collection, and there are still these provenance reports being done.
I mean, Mboro told us that he feels like one of these days someone's going to open the right box, there's going to be some note card, and it's going to say Mangi Meli.
There was that story that Konradin Kunze told us. He was talking about one of the German colonial officers who I think signed the execution order, and he had tracked him.
And there's one small trace which there is, like Moritz Mnyaka, this officer, he had 2 boxes of belongings from Tanzania that he said or brought to Germany. And among those things, there was also a mention of a skull. It was called a defect anatomical skull. It could as well be, because it was among those things from Tanzania, that this was Mangi Meli's head. But because it was in his home, nobody knew who is that person, and nothing was written, obviously, on it. So the museum bought this head for 8 marks. Lushan bought it for one of his students. So we don't know who is that person, like who is that student, and was it Mangi Meli or not? This is all speculation, but this is just to show that there is a possibility that his head is also ended up in some family possessions, and maybe it still is there, or maybe I couldn't find any trace.
All right, Peter. So what do you think? What's your best bet?
I mean, we don't know. I think there's still a chance that it turns up in some museum, or that he turns up in some museum somewhere, but you can't help but think about all of these, like the things that we don't know yet. There's still those 7 sacks of bones that were found in the ground in 2014 in Dahlem that were sent to the municipal crematorium immediately.
I mean, that would be tragic if it was...
Yeah. There's no sign that was there, but I mean, since then Berlin's had a world war. The museum has been, reduced to rubble, and all of these remains were found in the basement of a palace just after the war. And so this whole stuff has been shipped around a lot. We really don't know, but I think there's still a chance to find it. And as we've said, we found the other ones. We found the other Mangis.
Why is it so important then to get these ancestral remains back where they belong?
There's a line from the book Dig Where You Stand by Sven Lindqvist about the sort of legacy of history in this kind of way, which is, he says that, history pays dividends, which means that the money being made by these expeditions and being extracted back to Europe has continued to sit on the stock market, paying out dividends to the people who've got it for all of that time. But then also on the other side, sort of suffering has paid dividends too. That that extraction and things being taken out of a place means that place has had a sort of negative dividend paid to it, and that looking for these kind of human remains and trying to give them back and set things on an even keel means addressing that kind of rift.
It's been now almost 150 years since Karl Peters founded German East Africa. Karl Peters, who you remember was known to locals as Munkano wa Damu, which means bloody hands. But the effects are still being felt today. It's a lasting thing. There are families and communities right now fighting to get their ancestors back, making demands. And Peter, there's a new documentary coming out. It's called The Empty Grave. The filmmakers did a great job. They're showing how present this history is for the affected communities. You can still feel the effects of these crimes. You can see how it makes an immediate difference in their lives. We're going to hear from the filmmakers in a moment, but there was a professor we spoke to in Ghana who put this well. His name is Kodzo Gavua.
My name is Kodzo Gavua. The families in particular, they blame some disasters that happen or any ill fortune that happens to them. They blame on these remains that have not been buried.
Mboro also told us about once witnessing a swarm of locusts.
A locust came, and this locust thing I do remember very well because it was during the daytime, and then it turned dark. And on the sky, I could just only see things moving. And they eat each and every vegetation, and then you find then is hunger comes after that. And that's why these things are happening to us, because we haven't buried our ancestors.
Mboro saw swarms of locusts. Other people have talked about other things that they tie to not being able to bury their ancestors, whether it's climate change, the land changing, animals not producing as much, family accidents, financial misfortune, all kinds of things. And that might be a little bit hard for us to connect or to understand how it's related. Like, how can this that happened 100 years ago still be having these kinds of consequences today? But there are things that did change fundamentally in the land, that colonialism did change. I mean, to name one example, there's the Cece fly, which is a vicious thing, and it returned in huge numbers. It was able to swarm through southern Tanzania once that land there was cleared of people. I mean, cleared of people after the Mangi War, which was a colonial war that happened in Tanzania a few years after Mangi Meli was executed. We won't have time to go into that. But even if it's hard for us to understand this, there's still maybe other ways to think about that. We spoke to the filmmakers of The Empty Grave, that documentary film I mentioned a minute ago. Their names are Cece Mlay and Agnes Wegner. And we asked them about how the communities tie their circumstances to these missing ancestors.
My name is Cece Mlay.
And my name is Agnes Wegner.
Well, I think it's also them putting this idea of generational trauma in a language that is more accessible and understandable to them, and they were speaking about things that are on a familial level. Those are things that are close. When you're talking about, because they said people disappear in ways that we cannot explain, which is, if you think about it, that's a very moving thing for somebody to say. These things are having impacts on us directly. We cannot explain it because we are missing something here.
So, as Mlay said, this trauma is playing out down the generations. She said, people disappear in ways we cannot explain. And there's one scene in The Empty Grave, that film, which really gets to this. So here's what happens. There's a husband and wife, two family members from Tanzania, come to Germany trying to find their ancestors' remains. And they get a meeting with this German minister from the foreign ministry, Katja Koil, and they're not there alone. Mboro is there, and so is Konradin Kunze. Those two we've heard from in this episode. They're with them too in the film. And while the descendants, their names are John and Cecilia, while they look happy in this sort of impressive governmental office with nice furniture, lots of glass, the camera cuts to Mboro a few times and he looks much more pensive.
And towards the end of the visit, Katja Koil very surprisingly says that she is not only committed to this issue as a state minister, but also personally involved. And then she says she has a perpetrator in her family. And she doesn't say the name of that family member. She leaves it at that. The group left her office. Mnyaka, Sururu, Mboro asks John and Cecilia if they know who this family member of Katja Koil is. And then he says, it's Kai Peters.
When I saw it at the Berlinale, the whole theater sort of reacted with a mix of like humor, shock, dismay.
Oh, really?
There was there was an audible mouth noise that everybody made at once. It was sort of like, you got to be kidding me.
Again, it's just sort of the two lines of the story meeting again a few generations later, and it's kind of uncomfortable because the things that were stolen were still stolen.
Yeah, totally. And the story's still going. Katja Koil actually just went to Tanzania in March, just now, and issued a big apology.
As a German, I am ashamed of what our ancestors did. And I am deeply sorry.
As a German, I am ashamed of what our ancestors did, and I am deeply sorry.
I ask
that I may tender a sincere apology for the suffering that the colonists brought upon you. In order to know where we're going, we need to know where we came from. I bow to Mangi Meli and the other 18 chiefs we are commemorating today. I bow to all the other victims of German colonial rule in Tanzania. And then she said this.
And as a descendant of the Peters family, I personally ask your forgiveness in the name of my family.
And as a descendant of the Peters family, I personally ask your forgiveness in the name of my family. So, listen, this is the end of episode 1. In episode 2, we're going to talk about repatriation and how to return some of these ancestral remains, which seems like the obvious next step. Get these ancestral remains back where they belong. What happens, though, when you try and send ancestral remains back to the site of these catastrophes from 100 years ago? We're going to have to wait another month to talk about that when we'll release the next episode.
Dig Where You Stand is created by Peter Matthews and Benjamin Stoller. It's a production of Color Media presented by the Berliner Magazine.
This episode 1, was produced by Benjamin Stoller, Peter Matthews, and Rowan Ben Jackson. Music by Lawrence Van Oswald. Mix and sound by Rowan Ben Jackson. We're also at digwhereyoustand.show and at digwhereyoustandshow on Instagram. You can sign up for our mailing list there, and we'll notify you when we release our interview with the Empty Grave filmmakers. And, of course, we'll let you know when the next episode of Dig Where You Stand comes out. Maybe we'll even see some of you at the premiere of the film when it comes out here in Berlin in middle May.
Yeah, and you can read my article at the Berliner Magazine. It's the on the cover. And
yeah, go read Peter's article. It's on the-berliner.com.
Formerly known as Ex-Berliner.
Formerly known as Ex-Berliner. Otherwise, we want to say thanks to everyone we spoke with.
Yeah, Isabelle Reiman, Konradin Kunze, Mnyaka Sururu Mboro, Bernhard Heeb, Ilja Labischinski, Christopher Lee, Holger Stücker, Agnes Lisa Wegner, Cece, Mlay, Kodzo, Gavua, and Decolonize Berlin, who organized the symposium which started this whole thing for us.
If you're enjoying this kind of, essayistic history work, we'd love to hear from you and talk about it. You can also write us at mail@digwhereyoustand.show or just pass the link onto this episode to someone else you think would be interested. Thanks for doing this with us.
Cheers.
Since we are going to do this podcast about it, I think we wanted to know whether we should ask permission in this kind of way.
It will be nice, because that is that tradition, which it is not your tradition, but that is our tradition, which when we are talking about them, it is because in that tradition, and such symbols, you cannot imagine when people, those ones who are suffering, waiting, when they see such a report and such a start, how relieved they are. Even when now you are talking about it, and I started trembling. See, it gets it. That is. I mean,
can you help us do it? How can we do it appropriately?
There is no any important thing there. There is no any important thing. It's just only, see, as we know, as they do always before starting the discussion, then they take a silent minute, and this silent minute is to request them to be given the allowance to talk about them, and also promising them we are there to bring you back to your resting place. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.